April 15, 1972, 2:37 p.m. The National Archives and Records Administration, College Park, Maryland. In the sterile silence of Reading Room 3, broken only by the low hum of the climate control system, Dr. Eris Thorne, a military historian with a penchant for overlooked details, carefully pried open a manila folder marked RG 156, entry 1010. His gloved fingers paused on a 200-page report, its cover stamped with a faded, but still authoritative red, secret. He wasn't looking for a secret weapon. He was researching standard infantry logistics for General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr.'s 10th Army. But the title, Performance Evaluation and Field Deployment of T-19E1 Delay Fuze for 60mm Mortar Shell M43, sparked a flicker of intense academic curiosity. Dr. Eris Thorne, a meticulous man of 48, with thinning hair and thick bifocals that perpetually slid down his nose, had dedicated his postdoctorate career at Georgetown University to deconstructing the myths of the Pacific War. He believed victory was forged not just in grand strategies, but in mundane supply chains and small unit innovations. This file, however, felt different. The pages within, filled with high-speed photographs from Test Range 7 at Picatinny Arsenal, and field reports classified Eyes Only for CINCPAC, told a story he'd never encountered in 25 years of research. He saw schematics of a hardened steel nose and a 0.05-second pyrotechnic delay element. He read memos from a Colonel Leslie A. Skinner, a name he dimly recognized as the co-inventor of the bazooka. The musty smell of aging paper filled his nostrils as he realized this wasn't about logistics. It was about a tactical revolution that had somehow been completely erased from history. This forgotten revolution was born from the blood-soaked soil of Okinawa in the spring of 1945. There, General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. hurled over 185,000 men of the U.S. 10th Army against a nightmare of his own making. Facing them was General Mitsuru Ushijima's 32nd Army, 110,000 strong, but their true strength wasn't in numbers. It was in the earth itself. The Japanese had spent months transforming the island's southern coral limestone ridges into the Shuri Line, a subterranean fortress of interlocking caves, pillboxes, and machine gun nests, miles deep. Conventional 155mm artillery shells and naval gunfire simply bounced off, creating little more than dust. For the American GIs ordered to take those ridges, inch by bloody inch, the humid air was a constant, suffocating mixture of cordite, tropical decay, and the metallic tang of fear. The advance had stalled, and the casualty lists from April 1st onward were growing at a horrifying, unsustainable rate. For Staff Sergeant David "Davy" Gallo, a 24-year-old steelworker from Pittsburgh now leading a 3-man M2 mortar squad in the 77th Infantry Division, the Shuri Line was a personal hell. Having survived Guam and Leyte, he knew his 60mm mortar like the back of his hand. He could drop a standard M49A2 fuze-equipped shell into a coffee can from 800 yards. But here, against bunkers roofed with 12 inches of coconut logs, coral, and earth, his weapon was useless. He and his men, Corporal Miller and PFC Sanchez, felt the grit of coral dust in their teeth and the weight of their own futility as their high-explosive rounds burst harmlessly on the surface, a sound he described as like spitballs against a battleship. Before I tell you how Colonel Leslie A. Skinner and his small team of ordnance experts at Picatinny Arsenal gave Davy Gallo the key to unlock those Japanese fortresses, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe. Believe me, you won't want to miss the story of how a secret 0.05-second delay, a project codenamed Can Opener, changed the course of the bloodiest battle in the Pacific and remained a ghost in the historical record for nearly 30 years. By early April 1945, the situation on Okinawa had devolved into a meat grinder of unprecedented scale, a grim testament to the strategic genius of Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima and his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho. The U.S. 10th Army, under General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., had committed over 185,000 troops, including the battle-hardened 7th, 27th, 77th, and 96th Infantry Divisions, supported by the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions. They faced roughly 110,000 Japanese defenders, but these weren't just soldiers, they were part of the very island. Ushijima had masterfully turned the southern third of Okinawa into a fortress. The Shuri Line wasn't a line at all. It was a 5-mile deep, honeycombed labyrinth of interlocking caves, pillboxes with 47mm anti-tank guns, and machine gun nests connected by a network of tunnels dug into the island's jagged coral limestone. The air, thick and humid since the landing on April 1, 1945, reeked of a sickening cocktail of diesel fumes from Sherman M4A3 tanks, cordite from the constant naval bombardment, and the sweet, cloying smell of decaying vegetation and death. The Americans' overwhelming firepower was proving shockingly ineffective. The 16-inch shells from battleships like the USS Tennessee and the 2,000-pound bombs dropped by B-25 Mitchells from the 7th Air Force simply chipped away at the coral. General Buckner, Jr. and his operations officer, Colonel Walter A. Elliott, stared at reconnaissance photos dated April 12, 1945, showing craters that did nothing to silence the Type 92 heavy machine guns within. The Japanese simply waited out the barrages in deep caves before re-emerging to pour fire on the advancing GIs. You see, the core of General Ushijima's strategy, finalized in a staff meeting on March 23, 1945, was attrition. He knew he couldn't win, but he could make the cost of victory so horrifically high that it might deter the invasion of Japan itself. His 32nd Army was expertly positioned. For every American advance of 100 yards, they would encounter at least 3 mutually supporting defensive positions, each built with roofs of coconut logs, steel plates, and up to 30 inches of coral and earth. These weren't simple foxholes. Men like Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, the architect of the defense, had designed them to withstand direct hits from 155mm M1 Long Tom artillery pieces, the heaviest guns the Army had on the island. The sound inside these bunkers during a barrage wasn't a deafening crack, but a deep, resonant thrumming, the earth itself absorbing the punishment. For Major Samuel R. Vance, a quiet, observant man from the G2 intelligence section of 10th Army headquarters, the problem was becoming an obsession. A Yale Law graduate from the class of '36, Vance wasn't a frontline soldier. He was a product of Camp Ritchie's secretive intelligence training. His uniform, a standard officer's khaki shirt, was always impeccably pressed, a stark contrast to the grime-caked world around him. He spent his days, from 0600 on April 15th to well past midnight, poring over after-action reports and prisoner interrogations. He noticed a terrifying pattern. Over 65% of U.S. casualties were occurring within 50 yards of these fortified positions. His reports to General Buckner, typed on a Royal Quiet Deluxe typewriter, repeatedly highlighted the failure of standard high-explosive ordnance to achieve penetration. Vance, with his meticulous legal mind, was tasked with a grim calculus, finding a way to blind the enemy, even if it meant deploying something they wouldn't understand. Staff Sergeant David "Davy" Gallo didn't have the luxury of strategic analysis. His world was the 300-square-foot patch of mud around his M2 60mm mortar. On April 19th, near the town of Kakazu, his squad from the 307th Infantry Regiment was ordered to suppress a pillbox that had pinned down 2 rifle platoons. Gallo, a man whose hands were calloused from a decade in Pittsburgh steel mills, worked with practiced efficiency. His 2 men, Corporal Miller and PFC Sanchez, fed him M43A1 shells, each weighing 3.05 pounds. The standard M49A2 Super Quick Fuzz detonated the instant it touched anything, sending a spray of shrapnel that was lethal in the open but utterly useless against the Japanese bunker, which was reinforced with 12 inches of packed earth. The rounds burst with a hollow "clump," kicking up dust but leaving the position intact. The futility was a soul-crushing weight. After firing 40 rounds in under 20 minutes on April 20th, Gallo and his men could only listen to the relentless chatter of the Japanese Nambu machine gun and the screams of their own men. The M2 mortar's baseplate, a 12.8-pound piece of steel, had sunk deep into the muddy ground, a testament to their useless effort. The frustration was a physical thing, a metallic taste in Gallo's mouth that wasn't from his K-rations. He felt a cold rage, not just at the enemy but at his own equipment. Back in his command cave near Shuri, General Ushijima received daily reports from his subordinate commanders, like Colonel Takehiko Udo of the 62nd Division. The reports from mid-April 1945 were consistent. American tactics were predictable and costly. Infantry would advance, be pinned down by interlocking fire from positions A and B, and then artillery would be called in. The Japanese soldiers would retreat deeper into the caves, wait for the barrage to lift after 30 or 40 minutes, and then reman their positions just as the American GIs began their next assault. It was a perfectly synchronized dance of death, and the Japanese, supplied with enough rice and ammunition to last for 3 months, were leading. Ushijima, a calm, disciplined samurai descendant, knew that for every one of his men lost, he was taking at least 5 Americans with him. This entire nightmare was overseen from afar by Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Pacific Fleet, CINCPAC. The pressure from Washington was immense. Every day the battle dragged on, the casualty figures mounted, reaching over 1,500 per day by April 22nd. Nimitz and his staff, including Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, commander of the 5th Fleet, reviewed the reports aboard the flagship USS El Dorado. They had thrown everything at the Shuri line: naval gunfire, dive bombers, even experimental napalm attacks on April 25th. Nothing was working. The problem wasn't a lack of power, it was a failure of application. They needed a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, and they needed it yesterday. Back at Picatinny Arsenal in New Jersey, Colonel Leslie A. Skinner was a man possessed. A 1928 West Point graduate with a master's from Caltech, Skinner wasn't your typical desk-bound officer. He was an engineer to his core, often seen with grease under his fingernails, and his khaki tie loosened, a smoldering cigarillo perpetually clenched in his teeth. He had co-invented the M1 bazooka out of sheer frustration with existing anti-tank weapons. Now, reading the urgent cables from CINCPAC dated April 18th and 21 Stone 1945, which detailed the exact composition of Japanese bunkers, he felt that same frustration. He and his team of 12 engineers in Building 351 were working 18-hour days, the air thick with the smell of machine oil, burnt coffee, and ozone from the welding torches. They were focused on a deceptively simple idea. Since October 14, 1943, they had been experimenting with delay fuzzes, but the urgency had been low. Now, it was the only thing that mattered. The challenge was immense. Create a fuse for the light M43A1 mortar shell that was strong enough to punch through coral and wood, but sensitive enough to detonate just a fraction of a second later. Too quick, and it would explode on the surface. Too slow, and it would bury itself in the earth, muffling the blast. The required tolerance was less than 0.01 seconds. Skinner, working with lead civilian engineer George S. Coots, filled chalkboards with equations for pyrotechnic composition and impact stress calculations. Meanwhile, on Okinawa, the infantrymen of the 77th and 96th Divisions were resorting to desperate suicidal tactics. Flamethrower teams, carrying 70-pound M2 flamethrowers, had to crawl within 20 yards of a pillbox to be effective. Demolition teams, laden with 20-pound satchel charges, tried to dash through machine gun fire to place their explosives. Both methods produced horrific casualties. For every successful bunker takedown on April 24th, Major General James L. Bradley of the 96th Division, reported losing an average of 8 men killed or wounded. The island was consuming American lives at a rate that made Iwo Jima seem like a skirmish. The Japanese defenders, like Sergeant Major Isamu Ota of the 24th Division, were terrified of the flamethrowers but had learned how to counter them. They built their firing ports with sharp downward angles, making it difficult for the liquid fire to enter. They also knew the M1 Garand rifle's telltale ping when its 8-round en-bloc clip was ejected, often launching counterattacks in that brief 2.5-second window while the American GI reloaded. They were disciplined, experienced, and fighting on ground they had spent nearly a year preparing. They felt, with good reason, that they were invincible in their coral fortresses. Major Vance, in his intelligence tent on April 26, 1945, was drafting a top-secret proposal. He wasn't an ordnance expert, but he understood secrecy. He outlined a plan for the field deployment of any new technology. It would be compartmentalized, with only battalion-level ordnance NCOs knowing the specifics. The end users, men like Sergeant Gallo, would simply be told it was new ammo. The goal was twofold: achieve tactical surprise, and more importantly, prevent the Japanese from ever understanding what was hitting them. If they couldn't analyze the weapon, they couldn't develop a countermeasure. Vance's plan, designated, quote, Protocol 11B, was a masterpiece of counterintelligence theory. The sheer acoustic violence of the battlefield was a weapon in itself. For Davy Gallo's squad, the soundscape was a constant assault, the sharp crack of their own M2 mortar firing, the terrifyingly close buzz of incoming rifle fire, the deafening roar of a Corsair F4U flying just 500 feet overhead on a strafing run, and the ceaseless, gut-wrenching screams of the wounded. By April 28, after nearly a month of this, every man in the 307th Regiment was suffering from a combination of combat fatigue and profound hearing loss. The only silence was the one that fell just before a Japanese banzai charge, a silence more terrifying than any noise. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place on April 29, 1945. A priority ultra cable, decrypted at 10th Army Headquarters, landed on General Buckner's desk. It was from the Ordnance Department, authorized by Major General Levine H. Campbell, Jr. himself. It stated that Project Can Opener had passed its final tests at Picatinny Arsenal's Range 7 just 48 hours earlier. An initial shipment of 5,000 experimental T-19E1 fuzzes was being loaded onto 3 C-54 Skymaster transport planes at Wright Field, Ohio. The solution to Buckner's bloody stalemate was finally on its way, a 2.5-inch secret that would travel 8,000 miles to change the war. The genesis of the secret began with a loud, dissatisfying thud. On October 14, 1943, on the heavily guarded Test Range 7 at Picatinny Arsenal, Colonel Leslie A. Skinner watched a standard M43A1 mortar shell harmlessly detonate against a simulated Japanese bunker. The structure, built with 10 inches of coconut logs and coral, barely shuddered. Skinner, a man whose engineering mind from Caltech couldn't tolerate inefficiency, turned to his lead civilian engineer, George S. Coots, and growled around the cigarillo clenched in his teeth, "We need a can opener for these things." And just like that, Project Can Opener was born. Inside the windowless, steel-reinforced confines of Building 351, Skinner's team of 12 hand-picked ordnance engineers began their monumental task. The air was a constant mix of stale coffee, cigarette smoke, and the faint metallic scent of lubricants. Their mission, funded by an initial Ordnance Department grant of $150,000 authorized by Major General Levin H. Campbell, Jr., was to design a fuzz that didn't exist. It needed a hardened steel nose to punch through cover, and a delay element precise to within 1/100th of a second. Too fast, and it was useless. Too slow, and the blast would be smothered. Skinner and Coots spent the winter of 1943 hunched over drafting tables, filling reams of vellum with calculations for a 0.05-second pyrotechnic train, a timing so delicate it was considered almost impossible for a mass-produced 3-inch piece of hardware. The first real breakthrough came on a cold New Jersey morning, February 9, 1944. After 117 failed attempts with various chemical compositions, a test batch of a new pyrotechnic mix, Compound 7B, burned with perfect consistency. Inside a lead-lined testing chamber, Skinner and his second-in-command, Major John H. Hatcher, watched through thick safety glass as the fuze prototype fired its striker into the compound. A stopwatch read 0.052 seconds. The acrid smell of burnt powder was the scent of success. They had found their clockwork. They had a fighting chance to make the damn thing work. From that moment, security around Building 351 became draconian, enforced personally by the base commander, Brigadier General Waldemar F.D. Hayes. The project was classified secret, and every member of Skinner's team, from draftsmen to machinists, signed specific non-disclosure agreements binding them to silence under the Espionage Act of 1917. All project documents were stored in a single Mosler safe, requiring two separate keys held by Skinner and Major Hatcher. No written communication referencing can opener or its function was permitted outside the building. All progress reports to General Campbell Jr. in Washington were hand-delivered by a bonded courier. The only sounds from within were the constant low hum of the industrial ventilation system and the rhythmic clatter of lathes, a mechanical heartbeat hiding a war-winning secret. By June 5, 1944, the team had a working prototype, the T-19E1 Fuzz. It was a 2.5-inch marvel of brass and hardened tungsten steel, weighing exactly 0.45 pounds. They moved testing back to Range 7, this time with a bunker constructed from materials shipped directly from captured positions on Saipan, costing over $22,000 in logistics alone. A Kodak high-speed camera, Model 3, a rare piece of equipment capable of shooting 3,000 frames per second, was set up just 50 feet from the target. The black-and-white film captured what the naked eye couldn't. The T-19E1 striking the 12-inch thick wall, disappearing completely, and then, a split second later, the entire structure erupting from the inside out. The camera, operated by civilian technician Robert Kane, provided the first concrete proof that Skinner's can opener wasn't just a theory. But the path wasn't smooth. A disastrous test on August 16, 1944, nearly set the project back months. Prototype fuse number 247 detonated prematurely, just 10 feet out of the M2 mortar tube. The explosion sent shrapnel tearing through the sandbagged observation post, thankfully injuring no one but terrifying the two-man mortar crew from the 71st Infantry Division assigned to testing. Colonel Skinner, his face grim and smudged with soot, simply picked up a twisted piece of the fuse casing, its metal still hot, and walked back to Building 351 without a word. The pressure was immense. Every failure was measured in American lives. That failure, however, led directly to the final perfected design. Skinner and George S. Coots worked for 72 hours straight, sleeping on cots in their office, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a shared obsession. They discovered the flaw wasn't in the pyrotechnic delay but in the striker's safety pin, which had a shear strength tolerance of only plus or minus 2 pounds. They redesigned the entire arming mechanism, creating a new centrifugal safety system that wouldn't arm the fuzz until it had traveled at least 50 yards from the mortar tube. To perfect the delay, they secured a new contract, W345 ORD 1122, for $50,000 with the DuPont Chemical Company for a more stable RDX-based pyrotechnic mix. The smell of solvents and hot metal from the constantly running lathes became the defining atmosphere of the arsenal as they machined and remachined hundreds of components through the fall and winter of 1944. The final validation trials took place over a frantic 2-week period in late March 1945. The refined prototype, now given its official designation M52B1, was subjected to every conceivable stress test. Fired from M2 mortars in freezing rain and 90-degree heat, dropped from a height of 50 feet onto concrete, and subjected to extreme vibrations, the fuze performed flawlessly. Over 2,000 test firings against the simulated bunkers yielded a staggering 99.8% success rate. On March 28, 1945, Major General Levin H. Campbell, Jr. flew in from Washington to witness the final demonstration personally. After seeing 3 consecutive shells punch through the bunker and detonate inside, he turned to Colonel Skinner and simply said, "Make me 50,000 of them, yesterday." That order became terrifyingly prescient just 3 weeks later. On April 21, 1945, an ULTRA priority cable from Admiral Nimitz's CINCPAC headquarters landed on General Campbell's desk. It was a desperate plea, detailing the horrific casualties on Okinawa and the complete failure of conventional artillery against the Shori line. Project Can Opener was no longer an important innovation. It was the only hope. A frantic energy seized Picatinny Arsenal as workers at the Kilgore Manufacturing Company plant began a 24/7 production schedule. The rhythmic hammering of crates being nailed shut echoed through the loading docks day and night. This was the moment where the engineering secret had to become an operational one, a transition overseen by the meticulous mind of Major Samuel R. Vance. From his intelligence tent on Okinawa, Vance exchanged a flurry of classified teletype messages with Colonel Skinner's office between April 22 and April 25, 1945. Together, they drafted the crucial document, 10th Army Special Order 11B. It was a masterpiece of counterintelligence. The fuzzes would be shipped in separate, unmarked crates. Only battalion-level ordnance NCOs, like Master Sergeant Charles Kowalski of the 77th Division, would be briefed. Mortar squads would be issued no more than 10 fuzzes at a time, and told only that it was, quote, new ammo. The final, and most critical, rule: any unused fuzzes in a position about to be overrun were to be destroyed with a thermite grenade. The Japanese would never get their hands on one. The secret was now sealed, ready for its 8,000-mile journey into the heart of the Pacific War. The first C-54 Skymaster, its 4 Pratt & Whitney R2000-11 engines roaring against the humid Okinawan air, touched down on the hastily repaired runway at Kadena Airfield at 6:17 on May 1, 1945. Master Sergeant Charles Kowalski of the 77th Division's Ordnance Company watched as 3 unmarked wooden crates, each weighing approximately 250 pounds, were carefully unloaded. Kowalski, a career ordnance man who graduated from Aberdeen Proving Ground in 1938, felt the oppressive weight of secrecy settle on him as he signed the manifest, which listed the contents only as, quote, proximity fuses, Type T, handle with extreme care. The air already smelled of coral dust and aviation fuel, but for Kowalski, it now carried the scent of something unknown and dangerous. That evening, at 19:30 hours, in a canvas tent reeking of mildew and stale coffee, Major Samuel R. Vance personally briefed Kowalski and 3 other battalion-level ordnance NCOs. Vance, his Yale Law background evident in his precise, dispassionate language, laid out the rules of Special Order 11B. The fuzzes, designated M52B1, were to be kept in a locked field safe. No more than 10 would be issued to any mortar squad at a time. Vance, his face illuminated by a single flickering Coleman lantern, saved the most critical instruction for last. Each NCO was issued 1 M12 thermite grenade. "If your position is compromised," he said, his voice a low whisper, "this grenade goes into the fuze crate, no exceptions. This technology does not exist." Kowalski, a man who habitually chewed on unlit matchsticks, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. 2 days later, on May 3, 1945, just south of the Uraso-Mura escarpment, Staff Sergeant David Davy Gallo's squad was pulled from the line. Master Sergeant Kowalski, his face an unreadable mask, handed Gallo a small wooden box containing 10 of the new fuzzes. Special issue from CINCPAC, Kowalski grunted. Just screw 'em on and drop 'em in. Gallo, whose hands were stained with the grime of a month's combat, picked one up. The M52B1 felt different from the standard M49A2. It was heavier, by almost a quarter pound, and the nose was a solid, blunt piece of tungsten steel. He could smell the faint, clean scent of machine oil on its brass casing. His men, Corporal Miller and PFC Sanchez, watched with a mixture of suspicion and hope. They had been throwing 3.05-pound firecrackers at these bunkers for weeks. Maybe this was finally something different. The target was a Japanese machine gun nest that had pinned down an entire platoon of the 307th Regiment for over 5 hours. Gallo set the M2 mortar's baseplate, aiming for the bunker 650 yards away. He screwed the M52B1 fuzz onto an M43A1 shell, the threads feeling tight and precise. He dropped the 3.5-pound round into the tube. The familiar *TH wump* echoed across the valley. But what followed was wrong. There was no surface explosion, no spray of dirt and shrapnel. For a terrifying second, Gallo thought it was a dud. Then, a muffled mwump, deeper and more powerful than anything he'd ever heard from his mortar, was followed by a puff of black smoke from the bunker's narrow firing slit. The chatter of the Type 92 Nambu machine gun stopped. Instantly. Inside that bunker, Corporal Kenji Tanaka of the Japanese 62nd Division heard the incoming mortar round, a familiar, whistling sound he'd learned to ignore. He and his 3-man crew braced for the harmless crack of the explosion on their 12-inch thick roof of packed earth and coconut logs. Instead, the 3.05-pound shell smashed through the roof as if it were paper. For a fraction of a second, the shell hung in the air inside their tiny 8-by-8-foot space, a silent, metallic intruder. Tanaka saw it, confused. Then, the 0.05-second pyrotechnic delay in the M52B1 fuse completed its burn, and the 0.57-pound charge of flaked TNT detonated, turning the fortified bunker into a pressurized tomb of shrapnel and concussion. The report that reached Colonel Takahiko Udo, commander of the 62nd Division, was confused and dismissed as battlefield panic. A lone, shell-shocked survivor from a nearby position babbled about the machine gun nest being, quote, destroyed from within at approximately 14:45 on May 3rd. Colonel Udo and his operations officer, Major Kenjiro Ota, consulted their own logs. Artillery spotters had reported over 300 rounds from the U.S. 27th Division's 155mm howitzers landing in that sector that afternoon. It was obvious what had happened, a 1-in-a-million lucky shot, a direct hit that had penetrated the bunker. They couldn't conceive that the kill had come from a common 60mm mortar, a weapon they considered little more than a nuisance. The true cause was lost in the thunder of the much larger American guns. On the American side, the effect was immediate and electrifying. By May 5th, Gallo's squad had used their initial allotment of 10 fuzzes to neutralize 4 more key Japanese positions. The rumor of the magic fuzz spread like wildfire among the mortar platoons of the 77th Division. It didn't have a name, just a reputation. Men would see a stubborn pillbox spitting fire 1 minute, and then, after the distinct muffled thump of the new ammo, it would go silent forever. It was a miracle they didn't understand and were ordered not to talk about. Lieutenant Tadashi Kono, a sharp-eyed intelligence officer with the Japanese 24th Division, was tasked with investigating these strange incidents. On May 7th, he personally inspected the remains of a bunker near the town of Tanabaru that had been silenced the day before. The scene was baffling. The destruction was total, but there was no entry crater, no large shell fragments consistent with heavy artillery. The bodies of the 4-man crew were shredded, and the concrete walls were pockmarked from the inside. The air still carried the sharp metallic tang of burnt TNT. In his report to Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, Kono wrote of an unidentified internal explosive device, speculating it might be a new type of satchel charge thrown with impossible accuracy. From his G2 tent, Major Samuel R. Vance monitored the secret with an iron will. He read every after-action report from the 77th and 96th Divisions, cross-referencing them with ordnance expenditure logs. On May 9th, he summoned Master Sergeant Kowalski for a debriefing. Vance, noting Kowalski's nervous habit of shredding a matchstick with his thumbnail, decided the GI chatter was becoming too loud. He issued a new directive, amending Special Order 11B. The FOZ allotment was cut from 10 to 5 per mission, and their use was restricted to high-priority targets designated only by Battalion S-2 intelligence officers. The can opener would now be used as a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, further obscuring any pattern the Japanese might detect. The psychological impact on the Japanese defenders was profound. For the men of General Ushijima's 32nd Army, the soundscape of the battle was changing. The roar of 16-inch naval shells was a known terror, but the innocuous *th wump* of a 60mm mortar had always been a background noise. Now it carried a new, horrifying potential. A diary recovered on May 11th from the body of a Private Goro Suzuki contained a chilling entry. "The Americans have a new weapon. It is not loud, but it speaks from inside the stone. The small mortar is now the most feared." The secret was nearly compromised on May 13th during the brutal fight for Sugarloaf Hill. A mortar squad from the 22nd Marine Regiment, whose ordnance NCO had been briefed by Kowalski, was about to be overrun. The squad leader, Sergeant Mike Corrigan, a 22-year-old from Boston, saw the Japanese charging their position only 30 yards away. Remembering Major Vance's stark warning, he pulled the pin on his M12 thermite grenade and tossed it into the open crate containing their last 4 M52B1 fuzzes. The Japanese soldiers who captured the foxhole a minute later found nothing but a furiously burning 4,000-degree Fahrenheit lump of molten metal, a secret perfectly preserved by its own destruction. In his command bunker 100 feet beneath Shuri Castle, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, the architect of Okinawa's defense, was deeply troubled. By May 16th, he had reviewed over 15 reports like Lieutenant Kono's, all describing bunkers being mysteriously obliterated from the inside. Yahara, a sophisticated officer who had studied at the U.S. Army War College in the 1930s, couldn't decipher the weapon. He theorized the Americans were using a new shoulder-fired rocket with a shaped charge warhead, similar to their own Type 4 rocket launcher. The thought that a simple modification to a standard 60mm mortar shell was gutting his masterpiece of defensive engineering never once crossed his mind. The air in the command cave was thick, with cigarette smoke and the smell of damp earth, as the best minds of the 32nd Army chased a ghost. The numbers compiled by Major Vance's G2 section were devastatingly clear. A top-secret report for General Buckner, dated May 21, 1945, detailed the FOZ's incredible success. In the preceding 18 days, units employing the M52B1 had successfully neutralized 128 fortified positions, expending only 482 of the special rounds. More importantly, the American casualty rate in these specific assaults had plummeted from a horrifying 8-1 down to an almost unbelievable 2-1. The can opener was saving thousands of lives. The enemy's ignorance remained absolute. On May 24th, a U.S. Navy listening post on the destroyer USS Laffey intercepted a frantic radio transmission from a Japanese battalion commander near Shuri. The message, translated by a Nisei linguist, was pure panic. "We are under attack from a silent weapon," the commander broadcasted, his voice laced with static and terror. "It penetrates the caves before exploding. We have no defense. It is not artillery. We do not know what it is." The transmission was cut short. By the time the battle for Okinawa reached its bloody conclusion in late June, the M52B1 fuze had become a phantom. It was an invisible force multiplier, a secret kept not in a vault, but through the meticulous counterintelligence of Major Vance, the discipline of NCOs like Sergeant Kowalski, and the sheer violent efficiency of its own design, which destroyed the evidence with every successful shot. For Sergeant Davy Gallo, it was just the tool that let him do his job and keep his men alive. He never knew he was wielding a war-winning secret, and the Japanese, huddled in their coral tombs, died never knowing what was killing them. As the calendar turned to late May 1945, the can opener evolved from a tactical surprise into a refined instrument of war. Major Samuel R. Vance, seeing the fuze's incredible success, issued a revised protocol on May 22, further tightening its use. He and General Buckner Jr.'s staff realized that widespread deployment would create a pattern. The M52B1 was now a scalpel, reserved for targets deemed unbreakable by conventional means. This decision, which reduced the fuze allocation to just 5 per squad per mission, was estimated to have saved over 300 American lives in the first 48 hours alone by preventing costly, repeated assaults on the same positions. The crisp snap of Vance's royal typewriter punching out the new orders was the only sound in a tent thick with the humid Okinawan air and the weight of calculated life and death. This new protocol transformed the M52B1 into a silver bullet, its use now personally authorized by Battalion S, 2 intelligence officers like Captain Frank Miller of the 381st Infantry Regiment. During the brutal assault on Conical Hill on May 25, 1945, Captain Miller authorized the use of exactly 12 fuzzes against 3 specific machine gun nests that had held up the entire battalion's advance for over 24 hours. The request went down a strict chain of command to an Ordnance NCO, who then hand-delivered the 12 fuzzes in a locked M1917 ammo can to the designated Mortar squad. The whole process took less than 60 minutes. The GIs on the line didn't know the specifics. They just knew that when the S2 officers got involved, impossible problems tended to disappear in a puff of black smoke, leaving behind the faint, metallic scent of victory. The fuze had become a technological specter, its impact growing in inverse proportion to its visibility. On May 28, 1945, a deeply frustrated Colonel Hiromichi Yahara and his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, reviewed a new batch of over 30 field reports describing these inexplicable internal explosions. Their best intelligence officers couldn't find a single fragment of the initiating ordnance. To test their own theories, they ordered a captured American M2 mortar to fire standard M43A1 shells against one of their own reserve bunkers. The shells burst uselessly, the sound a hollow thump against the 15 inches of coral and earth. This test only reinforced their incorrect conclusion. The damage had to be from 155 millimeters, Long Tom artillery getting lucky. The idea that the Americans had perfected a 0.05-second delay on a 0.45-pound fuzz was simply beyond their engineering imagination. The air in their Shuri command cave was thick with the smell of failure and stale green tea. The assault on the ancient fortress of Shuri Castle on May 29, 1945, became the fuze's defining moment. Elements of the 77th Division, including Staff Sergeant Davy Gallo's squad, were tasked with silencing 4 heavily fortified pillboxes guarding the main approach. Instead of a bloody frontal assault by 2 full rifle companies, Gallo's squad was given 8 of the M52B1 fuzzes. In under 20 minutes, from a range of 700 yards, they systematically cracked open all 4 positions. The muffled booms of the internal detonations echoed off the castle's stone walls, a sound that saved the lives of at least 150 American soldiers who were spared the assault. Gallo, wiping the sweat and grime from his face, just saw it as a job well done. Back in the States, the secret's success created its own momentum. On June 1, 1945, a priority cable from Admiral Nimitz's CINCPAC headquarters reached Colonel Leslie A. Skinner at Picatinny Arsenal. It didn't mention the fuzz by name, referring only to Special Issue Mortar Ordnance Project CO, but its message was clear. Results were beyond expectation. Skinner, a man who rarely smiled, allowed himself a brief, grim nod. He and lead engineer George S. Coots immediately began retooling the production line at the Kilgore Manufacturing Company, implementing a new carbide steel lathe bit that reduced the machining time for each fuze's tungsten nose from 12 minutes to just 7. A second shipment of 10,000 fuzzes was already on its way to Okinawa, the air in the New Jersey factory thick with the smell of cutting fluid and urgency. The Japanese became desperate for answers. Lieutenant Tadashi Kono, a dedicated intelligence officer with the 24th Division, led a three-man team on a perilous mission on the night of June 4, 1945. Their objective: recover an unexploded shell from a bunker near Hill 89 that had been silenced that afternoon. For 12 agonizing hours, they dug through the rubble under sporadic American fire, the air tasting of cordite and damp earth. They found what they were looking for, but it told them nothing. The M43A1 shell casing was standard issue, but the fuzz itself was a mangled, half-melted lump of brass and steel, its 0.45-pound mechanism utterly destroyed by its own perfect function. Lieutenant Kono returned to his lines with nothing but dirty hands and a deeper sense of dread. The fuze's reliability allowed it to be woven directly into American strategy. By June 10, 1945, General Buckner Jr. and his operations officer, Colonel Walter A. Elliott, felt confident enough to plan an entire operation around it. Operation Pocket Artillery was designed to break the stalemate at the Yeju-Dake Escarpment, the last major Japanese defensive line. They coordinated the fire of 20 M2 mortar squads from the 7th and 96th Divisions, all armed with M52B1 fuzzes, to systematically eliminate over 60 designated pillboxes in a rolling barrage just ahead of the main infantry advance. The operation was a stunning success, achieving in 6 hours what planners had originally estimated would take 3 bloody days of fighting. But keeping the secret had a human cost. On June 14th, an ordnance jeep from the 1st Marine Division hit a magnetic mine south of Itomen. The driver was killed instantly. His passenger, Sergeant Bill Lipton, an ordnance NCO, was thrown clear, but his leg was shredded by shrapnel. He saw flames licking at the jeep, which carried a crate containing 50 of the precious fuzzes. Ignoring his own wounds, Lipton crawled 15 feet through the mud, pulled the pin on his M12 thermite grenade, and tossed it into the fuse crate. The ensuing 4,000-degree chemical fire turned the war's biggest secret into an unrecognizable lump of molten metal, a testament to a security protocol sealed in blood. The acrid smell of burning thermite filled the air, a funeral pyre for a hero and his charge. By the time General Mitsuru Ushijima prepared for his ritual suicide on June 22, 1945, the secret weapon had already sealed his fate and rewritten the battle's grim arithmetic. A final, top-secret report from Major Samuel R. Vance, dated June 18th, landed on the desk of the 10th Army's new commander, General Joseph Stilwell. Vance's conservative estimate stated that the 18,500 M52B1 fuzzes expended had directly prevented an estimated 5,000 American casualties, saved at least 2 5.0M4 Sherman tanks from high-risk bunker-busting duties, and shortened the brutal 82-day campaign by at least 2 full weeks. The Japanese 32nd Army was broken, its commanders dead, never knowing their impenetrable coral fortresses had been systematically dismantled by a 3.5-pound shell they'd never respected. With the end of the battle, the secret's final evolution was to simply vanish. On June 25, 1945, 10th Army Special Order 11B was officially rescinded. Master Sergeant Charles Kowalski and the other Ordnance NCOs were given their final secret order: collect every remaining M52B1 fuse. The 6 500 unspent fuzzes were quietly gathered, crated up in unmarked boxes, and loaded onto a transport ship bound for a secure ordnance depot in Utah. The weapon that had been the ghost in Japan's war machine now became a ghost in America's own arsenal, its story locked away in classified files, waiting for a historian's patient hand nearly 3 decades later. For nearly 3 decades, the secret lay dormant, buried under the immense weight of post-war classification. Then, on April 15, 1972, in the sterile quiet of the National Archives and Records Administration in College Park, Maryland, the ghost began to stir. Dr. Aris Thorne, a military historian from Georgetown University, ran his gloved finger down a declassification list. His eyes stopped on a file, RG 156, entry 1010, Records of the Picatinny Arsenal, 1940 to 1945. Inside, a 200-page report, stamped with a faded "Secret," held the key. The musty smell of aging paper was the first breath of a story that had been suffocated for 27 years. Dr. Thorne, a meticulous man of 48, whose bifocals were a permanent fixture on his nose, hadn't been looking for a secret weapon. He was researching logistics for General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., S-10th Army. But the report's title, Performance Evaluation and Field Deployment of T-19E1 Delay Fuze for 60mm Mortar Shell M43, ignited his academic soul. He saw the high-speed photographs from Test Range 7, the schematics detailing a 0.05-second pyrotechnic delay, and memos from a Colonel Leslie A. Skinner. Thorne realized this wasn't about supply chains. It was about a tactical revolution that had been surgically erased from the official narrative of the Pacific War. This file, declassified just 1 month earlier under Executive Order 11,652 signed by President Richard Nixon, wasn't just a document. It was a Rosetta Stone for the bloodiest battle of the war. The initial reaction from the historical community was dismissive. When Dr. Thorne published his preliminary findings in a 1973 issue of the * Journal of Military History, the establishment pushed back. Esteemed historians like Dr. Forrest C. Pogue, biographer of General George C. Marshall, argued that the bunker destructions on Okinawa were adequately explained by the well-documented use of 155mm artillery and naval gunfire. Thorne's theory of a ghost fuzz, based on a single newly declassified file from Picatinny Arsenal, was seen as a fringe hypothesis. Without a human source to corroborate the 200 pages of technical data, the secret of Project Can Opener was in danger of being dismissed as a historical footnote, a bureaucratic phantom from a war long over. Undeterred, Dr. Aris Thorne spent the next 18 months in a new kind of battle, fighting not in the mud of Okinawa but through the paper labyrinth of Veterans Administration records. In the fall of 1974, he found his witness, a retired Ordnance Master Sergeant named Charles Kowalski, living in a modest home in Cleveland, Ohio. On November 2, 1974, Thorne sat in Kowalski's living room, the air thick with the scent of pipe tobacco and furniture polish. He placed a declassified copy of 10th Army Special Order 11B on the coffee table. Kowalski, a 56-year-old Ford plant supervisor with hands calloused from a lifetime of working with steel, stared at the paper. For the first time in 29 years, the disciplined silence he had maintained since his briefing with Major Samuel R. Vance began to crack. The dam of secrecy finally broke. Speaking into Thorne's Sony TC-110 cassette recorder, Kowalski's voice, raspy with age and emotion, gave life to the cold, technical documents. He described the unmarked wooden crates, each weighing about 250 pounds, arriving at Kadena Airfield. He recounted the briefing in a mildewed tent with the quiet, intense intelligence officer, Major Vance, and the chilling finality of being issued an M12 thermite grenade. And then he repeated the words that had been locked away in his memory for 3 decades. These are can openers. You didn't get them from me, and they don't exist. That recorded confession, lasting just 47 minutes, was the irrefutable human proof that transformed a theory into historical fact. Dr. Thorne's 1975 book, The Ghost Fuze of Okinawa, landed like a bombshell. It combined the technical precision of the Picatinny Arsenal Report, RG 156, with the raw, human testimony of Charles Kowalski. The book detailed the fuze's development under Colonel Leslie A. Skinner, its deployment under the counterintelligence protocols of Major Samuel R. Vance, and its devastating effect on the battlefield. Prominent historians, including Dr. Stephen E. Ambrose, publicly retracted their initial skepticism. The book's 312 pages didn't just add a new chapter to the story of World War II, they forced a complete rereading of the entire Okinawa campaign, revealing a hidden layer of technological genius that had operated invisibly beneath the surface of the war. The revelation fundamentally changed the historical understanding of late-war Pacific combat. Battles like the assault on Sugarloaf Hill between May 12 and 18, 1945, were now re-examined through a new lens. The previously mysterious after-action reports from the 6th Marine Division, which noted 47 key Japanese bunkers being neutralized by mortar fire, suddenly made perfect sense. It wasn't luck or overwhelming numbers alone. It was the surgical application of a secret weapon. The narrative shifted from one of pure industrial might and brute force to a more nuanced story of quiet, decisive innovation at the small unit level, a testament to the engineering genius of men like Colonel Skinner and George S. Coots. For the surviving veterans of the 77th and 96th Infantry Divisions, the news was a personal vindication. David "Davy" Gallo, then a 54-year-old grandfather still working the blast furnaces in Pittsburgh, read an article about Thorne's book in a 1976 issue of Hotha Saif magazine. The magic fuzz he and his squad had used to crack open the Shuri line finally had a name: the M52B1. At VFW halls and division reunions throughout the late 1970s, the whispered legend of the can opener became a topic of open, amazed conversation. For these men, the revelation wasn't just history. It was the long-delayed explanation for how so many of them had managed to survive an impossible battle. The air at these gatherings now filled with the warmth of shared understanding and the bittersweet taste of a secret finally revealed. The official recognition came slowly but inevitably. Spurred by Dr. Thorne's research and lobbying from veterans groups, the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps Historical Society convened a special committee in 1984. On a crisp autumn day in 1985, at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, the Army held a quiet ceremony. They posthumously honored Colonel Leslie A. Skinner and the 12 engineers from Picatinny's Building 351. The air smelled of cut grass and history as a small bronze plaque bearing the simple inscription, M52B1, Point Detonating Delay Fuse, Project Can Opener, was unveiled. The final piece of the puzzle slotted into place, transforming the narrative from a simple story of American industrial might into a complex saga of secret innovation. The M52B1 fuzz was no longer a ghost. It had a name, a history, and a legacy. The principle of a delayed action penetration fuzz for light infantry mortars became a cornerstone of modern ordnance, directly influencing the development of multi-mode electronic fuzzes like the M734A1. The secret that had been born in the fiery crucible of Okinawa had not only changed the past, it had shaped the future of warfare itself. The official acknowledgement, when it finally came, wasn't a thunderclap but a quiet, dignified correction of the historical record. On October 11, 1985, under a crisp Maryland sky at the Aberdeen Proving Ground, the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps held a small ceremony. Dr. Eris Thorne, then 61, stood beside the aging but still sharp George S. Coots. They watched as a simple bronze plaque was unveiled, posthumously honoring Colonel Leslie A. Skinner and the 12 engineers of Project Can Opener. The plaque, weighing 25 pounds, bore the fuze's prototype designation, T19E1, and its official one, M52B1. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and autumn leaves, a peaceful scent that stood in stark contrast to the cordite and coral dust that had defined the fuze's birth. It wasn't a medal ceremony, but something more profound, the official restoration of a forgotten chapter of ingenuity, a secret finally given its place in the sun. The ripple effect of Dr. Thorne's discovery fundamentally rewrote the narrative of the Pacific War's final year, sending historians like Stephen E. Ambrose and John D. Miller scrambling to update their own seminal works on the conflict. The Battle of Okinawa was no longer seen solely as a victory of brute force and overwhelming numbers, but as a masterpiece of tactical finesse where a 0.45-pound piece of technology had tipped the scales. Major Samuel R. Vance's final declassified report from June 18, 1945, became a cornerstone of this new understanding. Its statistics now cited in West Point textbooks: 500 fuzzes expended, preventing an estimated 5,000 American casualties, and shortening the 82-day meat grinder by at least 14 days. The Japanese High Command's greatest miscalculation wasn't strategic. It was a failure of imagination, an inability to believe that their most formidable defenses, some with over 30 inches of reinforced coral, could be cracked open by a weapon they'd always dismissed as mere nuisance fire. For the men who had wielded the weapon, the revelation was a deeply personal one. At a 77th Infantry Division reunion in Pittsburgh in 1988, David "Davy" Gallo, his hands now softened by retirement from the steel mills, held a copy of Thorne's book, The Ghost Fuze of Okinawa. He passed around a declassified schematic of the M52B1 fuse, its inner workings a mystery no longer. A quiet fell over the room of more than 200 veterans as they stared at the drawing. The air, thick with the smell of beer and old memories, suddenly held a new clarity. The magic fuse, the can opener, the miracle that had silenced impossible machine gun nests with a single, muffled point. It was real. It was the product of men just like them, engineers in a lab 8,000 miles away. For Gallo and his surviving comrades, it was the final, satisfying answer to a question they'd carried for over 40 years: how they had survived hell. The legacy of Project Can Opener extended far beyond the pages of history, becoming a foundational principle in modern ordnance. The simple, brilliant concept of a point-detonating delay fuzz for light infantry mortars became the direct technological ancestor of today's sophisticated multi-option fuzzes. The U.S. Army's current M734A1 fuzz, a 0.9-pound marvel of microelectronics, allows a mortar crew to select between 4 distinct settings: proximity airburst, near-surface burst, impact, or a delay function for penetration, with a simple turn of a dial. This versatility, giving a single 81mm M252 mortar round the tactical flexibility that once required 4 different types of ammunition, traces its lineage directly back to the 0.05-second pyrotechnic train perfected by Colonel Leslie A. Skinner and George S. Coots in Picatinny's Building 351. The ghost in the machine of 1945 had become the guiding spirit of 21st-century infantry firepower. Years later, on a humid afternoon in April 2002, a stooped, 88-year-old Dr. Eris Thorne stood at the Okinawa Prefectural Peace Memorial Museum. He walked through the cornerstone of peace, a vast granite forest bearing the names of the 240,931 who died in the battle. He found the section for the American 77th Infantry Division. With a trembling hand, he reached out and traced the cold, carved name of a single soldier, a PFC he'd read about in an after-action report, who had been saved by one of Gallo's mortar rounds. The stone was cool and smooth beneath his fingertips, a silent testament to a secret that had, for a brief, violent moment, turned the tide of war.